Morning, everybody. So you can see us?
Yes.
Excellent. So welcome to the contract management webinar presented by LGP and Arc Blue and Ford. So I'm Mark Osborne. I'm the project manager at LGP, and it's a delight to have you all on a beautiful sunny day. So both Jerome and I are sitting in the LGP office. I think we're the only two in the office, so it's kind of interesting and fun working through all that. So today we're using Zoom to present the, to go through everything. So asking is if we could just mute our microphones to begin with. I'm also asking that if you have questions, there is a chat feature down the bottom of the page. Please record your questions on the chat and we can come through it, or come to that later. If we have any questions, any technical questions, please do a side chat to Jerome and we can work out what we need to be doing to cover off all the issues. But the most important thing of today is that it's going to take about an hour to work through this presentation. There'll be a few people on presenting. So Luke's going to present, Oliver's going to present, and I'll be doing a little bit of work. And we hope you enjoy our presentation on how the CLMS system is working. So our agenda for today, so it's me just doing the introductions. Luke's going to be talking through the CLMS product. Oliver is going to be stepping it through. I'll be doing some pilot council updates, the 4 pilot councils that we've already got running. And at the end, we've got some Q&A. We're recording today, so any questions that we've got, any information, this will be available to us afterwards. So that's probably the start point. So Luke, are you online?
I am.
Okay, Luke, do you want to take control? And we're just going to stop sharing the screen and we're passing across to Luke. So everybody, okay. Luke Kenny, CEO of LGP.
Thanks, Mark. Welcome all. And yeah, well, I think everyone's on mute, which is good. It's always a bit awkward when something goes off in the background when you're not on mute, as we learn VC a bit better. But please do that. Please feel free to use the chat for any questions you've got. What I'm going to talk you through in the next 5 or 10 minutes is just share with the group why we're doing this. I think it's important to realise why at the start of last year LGP took on this pursuit to look at a contract lifecycle management system for the sector. And it's pretty interesting when you start to reflect on what contract lifecycle management is. At its simplest, it's something that just delivers or ends up delivering the value you thought you were going to deliver from a tender process. If you don't have good contract lifecycle management in your contracts, all that value you identified in your tender process, it's really hard to realise. Then if you go to its most complex, if you look at the full capability of any contract lifecycle management system, no matter it's the one that we're talking about today or any system, in my view, the most complex has all the elements of risk assessment, performance review. It does market analysis or commands you to do market analysis or feed into your contracts market analysis, and then can deliver some unseen value from your contracts across the sector. So there are some things to think about in terms of what these systems actually do, but I think more so, move away from the system itself. Think about what is contract lifecycle management and what can it do for your council, and then you start to look at system and enablement. Why we got started, and you may remember us talking about this last year, is in 2018, the Audit Office released their first report on the local government sector, and it wasn't glowing in the context of our work as a sector around managing contracts. One of the findings was 50% of councils had failed to conduct any form of risk assessment before entering into any contract. And this is where the Audit Office took, from every council, a contract worth more than 150 grand and ran a test. And this is what they found. We weren't doing risk assessments. We didn't do any sense of a contract performance evaluation. Even during the middle of a contract or towards the end of a contract, no one was, in their findings, 50% were saying that they haven't done any sort of performance appraisal. The contract variations were approved by an officer, and that variation was outside their delegation, which means changes were happening mid-contract with no one else's visibility. This is where some of contract lifecycle management practice comes in to controlling some of the things that we can't really afford. And you look at that last example, variations being made by someone outside of delegation, that is ripe for corruption, fraud. And again, we go back to our friends at ICAC and look at some of the stories that our sector's managed to create for itself. That's an example of practice that we need to look at how we control. Whether it's a system or otherwise, it comes back to how you manage your contracts. And many of the councils the audit office found had no contract management plan. There was actually no plan. And I think maybe the message here from the audit office is saying, we're really great at tendering, but once the contract's in play, it goes on the shelf until it needs to be renewed. And then we lift it off the shelf and we go to market and we run a tender, we get a new contract and we put it back on the shelf again. And I think what we're talking about here is it's an opportunity. Contract lifecycle management is an opportunity to start to extract some more value, lift what we do with our contracts, deliver better value in terms of the people we serve internally and externally by having better process around this sort of stuff. The system that Ollie and others will talk about a little bit later on is an enabler. I guess what I'm talking about is the actual practice and the things that we need to start looking at. And I guess this is why you're here. You've all logged on to have a conversation and learn a little bit more about what contract lifecycle management is. If I go to systems, contract lifecycle management systems have been discussed around the local government sector for years, even before I arrived 3 years ago. The sector's been talking about we need a CMS, we need a contract management system that will fix all our problems. But I don't see many councils, all of 128 of them, who has conquered this space. I actually can't, to be honest, I can't see one that's conquered it. And so it's a glaring gap. And when we go back to what the audit office found, and then no one's been able to deploy, in my view, and I'm happy to be corrected, no one's deployed a robust system to manage contract management. I'm not surprised the audit office is finding what they're finding. I think the other challenge around system here, and maybe this will form some questions later in the chat, is councils are wrestling between choosing an external system, which I think a lot of them are pretty expensive from what I know. And then secondly, are you then wrestling with the fact that you've got a finance system with a module that's got a contract module in it? And you're saying to yourselves, well, we should use the module that's inside our Tech One or our Civica platform, as opposed to going to a system that's outside. And I think that's a bit of a dilemma for some councils. We're hearing that a little bit at the moment as to, well, I need to optimize the platform I have. And for some reason, we bought this module. The module's been created, in my personal view, modules created inside an ERP system for contract management is developed by software developers guided by someone who might know something about contract management. The external systems instead are external systems that are built by people who know contract management. And this is where the challenge can come with ERPs. And you guys might correct me later on. You might disagree. You might say to me that the modules bolted onto ERP systems are quite good and they're pretty robust. But from what I've seen, I think they're a little bit too generic, built by software people with someone in the background telling them what contract management should be. So what do we went to tackle this issue, right? People weren't getting solutions. We're not seeing a proliferance of these systems in council and function. We're seeing some confusion. We're seeing some anxiety around which ones to choose. So we went to tackle it. We picked up the report. We said, what are we going to do about it? We are not going to bother trying to negotiate with Tech One and Civica. No offense to us, we're not big enough to be able to force Tech One to do something for us. But instead, we went and found a system and a platform that's affordable and that is going to deliver some sense of that early practice. We found that system. We needed a system that could be simplified to allow councils to get started. So let's not assume all 128 councils have the same level of maturity or capability. And we've catered for that here, I think, in terms of what we're trying to do. And we can scale in terms of the complexity in systems, in terms of how they mature their practices as we go forward. And that was with Port. You know, they were given the challenge. Mark and Chris and Ollie and Andre were all given the challenge to say, we don't want your full system. Their full system goes end-to-end, source to contract, no drama. But I didn't believe that our sector was ready for that yet. We wanted something very simple, and we forced them to cut it right back to say the starting point is very simple. And then once councils become efficient in these systems, then they can start driving the functionality to wherever they want to go. But we needed, and we appealed to Port to create a platform that was cost effective and it was simple for councils to get started. And that's what we've got. We chose Port because they had an ear for what we were looking for. Had we taken that same appeal to some other software manufacturers, we wouldn't have got the same outcome. They wouldn't have agreed. They would have challenged it. Port's an Australian-owned startup, born here in New South Wales. They have the end-to-end complexity of a contract lifecycle management system, but they're able to adapt, and they're prepared to listen to creating a simplified platform. It gives us the control, the knowledge, and the data that will empower, I think, council centre-led and decentralised procurement functions, because I still maintain there's not a centralised procurement function in council in New South Wales, but this platform allows different models to be adapted and deployed across what they're doing. And I think it allows our decentralised and our centre-led procurement functions to add more value by using something like this, mostly from my mind, through the control, through the knowledge, and through the data that comes out of a system once you invest some time and effort setting it up. And then having, Port's got to have this ability to relax a little bit. God love us in local government, we're not fast. We take a while to adopt things, and we've said to them they have to be patient. And if they're prepared to be patient, they will be rewarded later. So they've got that attitude. They know that we're going to take a little bit of time. We're going to do our pilots, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But in time, we will progressively move into the contract lifecycle management space, and Port have got an attitude to partner with us over the medium and long term, which is important. And then we need an implementation partner in ArcBlue. They've done this before. They know the local government sector. We already partner with ArcBlue on other fronts, and they're an important aspect of making sure councils are supported in the adoption of these systems. When you make a decision to deploy something like this, you are not making a technology decision, you're making a change management decision. And you need someone to help you through that. LGP's here, but we've also brought ArcBlue into the space to be able to walk people through it. Michael, Kerry, those people are guiding our councils through this process of change. And they are also themselves accredited in the Port platform. So it was a natural marriage between the three of us. So LGP leading it into the sector, Port's got the system, ArcBlue's got the implementation capability, and that's really what we created off the back of that 2018 Audit Office review. Before I finish up, some of the things to think about in terms of what I think are the benefits for councils if you go down any sort of contract lifecycle management practice. Be it a system, be it not a system, be it your council deciding you're going to do something about contract lifecycle management. It'll allow the procurement professional and your leadership team to understand what's happening with your procurement policy, practice, compliance. Because through this activity, you'll be able to see who's doing what, which of your decentralised or centre-led buyers are following the contracts you've asked them to use. It'll also allow you, going down this path, to design, implement and track behaviour change. Now that could be a good and a bad behaviour change, but if you start to go into contract lifecycle management, you'll see what your people are doing across council. You have decentralised buyers. You can start to monitor what they're doing when they're complying with contract, or they've gone maverick and they're buying outside of contract. You can track that. And finally, I think the most important thing is you use data and reporting to drive executive decision making. Right now, I think we lobby and we might put assumptions, we might put some disclaimers up, but as we start to get into proper contract lifecycle management, we've got data and knowledge we can use to force decisions. I think a contract lifecycle management system for a procurement function is going to hold all the data for all the contracts in council. I'm not sure there's a council in New South Wales who knows where all their contract data sits, and that's a challenge. If we go down the context of putting in a system, it starts to force councils to address that challenge. You get to have, with a system, you get to have a view on activity across all contract suppliers in council. Equally too, you get to automate some supply performance management. So I talked earlier about the fact the audit office says we don't performance manage. If you put in a system, be it the one we're talking about today or another one, you get to automate that process and you get to set it up properly from the outset. And ultimately, I think with a system running and your practice and your compliance, procurement becomes a sought after knowledge centre. People, you're no longer chasing internal stakeholders. I think you will find when you set something up in a system and you become the beholder of all the knowledge on every contract in council, they will be chasing procurement to ask the questions about a contract they know exists, they know they should be using, but because you hold the data, you hold all the knowledge. And this is where you draw your internal stakeholders back to you in terms of what you do. So that's really what I see as the benefits of contract lifecycle management. Ollie's going to talk about systems more, and everyone else will also, but I just share that in terms of my view. What we're going to show you today, we're going to talk about, we've talked about what's contract lifecycle management. Why is it something we're not really doing now? I've talked a little bit about that. We're going to talk about where do you start today? Maybe, are you ready? You know, one of the other questions to think about, are you actually ready? And some things to think about here as you go through the day is not only the context and the system, but do you have that executive sponsor? Is there a contract lifecycle management system able to fit or support an aspect of your strategic plan? Because if you do go down a path, again, whether it's us or someone else, you're going to need some executive support on that. And there's going to need to be some strategic alignment. It could just be compliance. It could just be risk. It doesn't matter. Having all your internal stakeholders briefed. You can't just deploy any management, any contract lifecycle management approach without your internal stakeholders somewhat on board. Otherwise, you're going to be a lone advocate. Think about where your data lives. Do I know where all my data lives? And how would I get it if I needed to get it, and having budget? So they're just some things that we talk about in readiness. And I guess it's LGP's job to walk you through those different aspects. If you are ready to go, if your council has an appetite to do this, this is where Mark and I and the BDMs come in from an LGP perspective to help you with it and get you ready to get going. So I leave you with those things to think about as we go along. We're going to share a lot about contract lifecycle management now, but hopefully that sets it up a little bit as to why we did it, what's the benefit, some things to think about from a strategic perspective, and then finally where we can help those councils who are joining us today who are interested in pushing on. So Mark, I might leave that there and let you hand over to the next stage. So thank you.
Thanks, Luke. Thanks for your time. Ollie, if you could unmute and share your screen, and if you're good to go, that'd be fantastic.
All right. If everyone could just, let's give it a minute, make sure everyone can see it, and then I'll jump into it.
So we can see from our end now. So we're looking at
perfect. All right. So this is an example of the hub. So what we're going to see in this solution is there's essentially two key elements. The front element that I'm showing right now is the hub, so the Arc Blue Portal Hub and the LGP Hub. And right now we've just got an example that's branded for Port Macquarie Hastings. So you can see how it looks when you choose to brand it with your own colors and banners and logo at the top. What this element of the solution is essentially the entrance for most of your users. So it's where they're going to be going in when they're not entirely sure where they need to jump on in the contract management process. It isn't the bit that contains all the detail. That's the Port CMS solution in the back, and I'll show you that in a minute. But this is where you'd expect most people to be interacting. So just at a high level, the sort of buttons we have here is a buying guide, accessing contracts, starting new procurement requests, and then along the bottom here, you have your reporting, your learning academy if you're part of the LEAP program, and then procurement documentation. Now, procurement documentation is loaded up with all sorts of best practice templates provided by LGP, and can be populated with your council's own details as well. So you'll see within there's all types of templates you can start to look for. Now, depending on what sort of situation you're going through, one of the most common things for a user to be doing is trying to work out whether they can buy off a contract that already exists, or if they need to start a new tendering process, or at least engage a contract through a simple quoting process. So normally you'll be going through guided buying, and it's going to start to ask you some questions. So you might go, I think there's a contract available, let's search the contracts. And it's going to provide you a list of all the contracts in category form. So maybe it's going to be a cleaning contract you'll go looking for, or IT telecoms contracts. Now, parking and security real estate, they're grayed out because none of those contracts exist in the system that's behind all of this. So you see it is a little more intelligent than just showing you every possible option. It can tell whether there's something behind it and populate that accordingly. Another way you might be interacting with the system is instead going, I'd like to access my contracts or add a contract. Now, obviously there's a lot of options here. Depending on which button you click through, it's going to lead you through into the port system. So let's assume we've just gone and said, I want to access my contracts. It's going to pop you in the contract dashboard, which is what we're seeing here, with showing all the contracts that you have access to as a user. So this is it. Sometimes this list will be filtered to show a certain category you've selected. Sometimes it will be throwing you right into the creation of a new contract. The hub is all about guiding you or users that are not using the system very frequently on where they need to go. It's all about making that information easy to access. When we get to the port side of the solution, it's really about that quite as heavy as you need it to be contract management process. So I'm just going to jump into a contract example. Now, I'm aware this isn't a full demo, so I'm just going to be light touching on all the key elements that the pilot groups have found really interesting, and then some of just the overarching elements that help tie that all together. So what we've got here is a synthetic grass sports field maintenance example contract. You'll see that it has a contract number, just an identifier. This can be used off whatever systems you currently have numbering your contracts, or it can be generated by us. What we're finding is most people already have a pretty good contract numbering format, whether it's driven off their ERP or the tendering process. Either way, they've got a number, and it's all about populating that for consistency. Titles should just be easy to understand. Now, what we have here is a status and a stage. Now, this is what really speaks to the element of port that really defines it above most of those simpler options. Is every contract has a life cycle. It's not about just giving in data and saying, cool, that's a contract, someone signed it, it's all good, let's check it in 12 months. It's about having a contract go through a process. So right here, you'll see that the contract is currently in the contract management planning stage. And that I'll show you as we go through. It means all the activities and the assessments and the milestones that have been created are based on that concept that right now this contract is about planning. It's about making sure you know when you're going to do assessments. It's about checking that your compliance activities are telling you that, yes, all the right people have signed off. Yes, we've had the work health and safety checks performed by the supplier. It's those sorts of tasks. Then you've just got some of your really key details. So your synthetic grass, whether it's expense or revenue, and contract type. Now, contract type is another key field we use, and it speaks again to that workflow. Not every contract has to have the same workflow. A goods and services contract can have completely different steps to a building and construction, which is what we've found with all the pilot groups. Almost all of them have had their construction group, whether it's because of project management, either way, they're doing a lot of those contract management activities already, and they're at a slightly more mature state than your standard contracts. So we are seeing that they're typically having a different process and following a few extra steps. Then you start to get to the organization details. Now, one of the interesting and useful bits about Port is it never just shows you details at a contract level. You can actually roll it up and look at it at a supplier level. So you click on a supplier, you can then see all the key details with that supplier, as well as review assessments performed against that supplier, whether it's directly or at a contract level. Now, I won't go into too much detail here because I know the contract management's the core of this, but what it's essentially a really helpful step whenever you get to the point where you go, who else is having engaging this supplier? What are their previous contracts? Were any risks and issues associated with that supplier outside of the contracts I'm looking at? So it can be really good for that holistic view of suppliers rather than just reviewing them on an individual contract point of view. Because some suppliers can perform excellent on one contract and not so good on the other. And if you're looking at individual contracts, it can be really hard to see that disparity. Next key area of Port and in a contract that every contract's going to have is your costs and times. Now, this is pretty standard. It's what you'd expect. It's the spend on the contract broken down by categories. So in most situations, we find it's easy to just select one high-level category. Again, building and construction is the bit of an exception there, where they do have quite detailed breakdowns on whether it's there's the initial construction and then there's certain maintenance breakdowns following that. And then if those categories are different, they're all going to roll up to your totals here. And then again, the option to track expenditure. So you can track expenditure against contracts, not just their total initial contracted value. So you can track how a contract is going and how much is being spent against it. Budget breakdown. So if your contract is based on certain financial years rather than just all in one financial year, you could break that down and show it. And obviously a lot more reporting functions that you're not likely to use to start with unless you already really need to drive reports off them. It's more about going down that maturity pathway where you go, cool, now that we've got all our contracts and we're managing them, it would be great if we could manage the cost center association with those as well. And then there's fields already established in port that can be turned on to use that. Last one down the bottom here, which is always very important, this is where we can track the extension options. So if it's a 1+1+1 type contract, we can track it here. So that in this example contract, it's got 2 extensions of 12-month period and then the associated financial value of that. So it'd be an extra 50,000 to execute on both those years. And this comes down to when it goes to renewing contracts. These are already renewals that you've established and put in the record, and it's just about executing those or marking them as renewed, opposed to going through a more detailed variation process, because there is a slight distinction there between a variation and an extension. Now, the 2 other key elements when it comes to contract management, so I might jump around these tabs in a bit more of a hierarchical order so I can show the key bits, is compliance. So compliance should be seen as the steps to managing a contract. So what we've done here, and this is what the pilot group has helped us establish, we've got a relatively standard list across the groups that was then just tweaked for every individual council for more suited for their needs. And this is about, okay, I've just created a contract and it's in planning stage. What do I need to do to ensure this contract has been planned? And you'll see we've got a series of steps here. Some of them obviously won't be applicable to everyone, but it is about just turning on those steps that you require or turning off the ones that aren't applicable to you. So it would be provide executed contract, for example, or update renewal options and alerts. Now, each of these have instructions underneath them that tells you how to enact this process in port. Now, what this can be is it can be instructions not to do an import. We completely accept that sometimes when it comes to these activities, you're going to already have an established process that you want to stick to for now. And frankly, if that's the way you want to go, it's totally okay. And it's probably the best way to transition into a new system. It's not about doing it all at once. It's about working your way up to having all that information. However, if you wanted to say, all right, to start with, these 3 activities are key, they can be marked as mandatory. So you can ensure that for a contract to be created and to be used, we at least want to ensure that someone's provided the executed contract and we've documented payment milestones, for example. Then every user can go through the record and say, yep, I've completed activity, I've provided an executed contract, or they can look here and go, actually, it's not applicable. So there's always an option to mark it as not applicable. It's not applicable for me to conduct transition activities because there wasn't a previous supplier. There is no transition. This is a new sports field, for example. So as you click through these, each of these are going to guide you, whether it's through to your standard business process or through to activities in port, it's going to tell you how to enact these tasks. So something simple like documenting payment milestones, that's going to give us some instructions and some screenshots, which are going to lead us through to milestones, which is the next really meaty tab when it comes to planning a contract. So what we have here is, again, a pre-populated list of milestones that we're seeing a lot of these councils buy into and find that they're quite useful, as well as populating those above what you'd actually expect or above what the standard of users to use is. So one of the models we really are trying to push with our pilot council and has been really well adopted is the idea that it's significantly better to have a lot of these elements populated here. Whether they're truly required or not, it's definitely a nice reminder for users to go, okay, I could have quarterly supplier meetings, or maybe I only want to have one, but either way, it's told you and given you details on how to do those. So if I wanted to have a quarterly supplier meeting, I'd be just updating each of these dates and going, yep, I'm expecting to have this meeting on the 15th of July. I'm going to save it. But for whatever reason, perhaps I've decided actually they're only going to be 6 monthly, so let's not have quarter 3. So that's one way to do it at the contract level, or you could do that at the template level, like explained. So all the way on the flip side, you could be defining that every single contract is only going to be having a 6-month review. So one of the things that we've found with the pilot council is supplier reviews are a bit inconsistent on how they're being enacted, not even just from council to council, but from contract to contract, department to department, value to value. There's not overly amount of consistency. So what the step everyone has taken so far has been is, no matter what, we want to make sure that there is a supplier assessment performed at the end of every contract. So no matter what, regardless of how they've done, at the end of the contract, right before renewal, we're going to have some details on how they performed. When it comes to doing those supplier assessments, there's a section in port called assessments. Pretty self-explanatory when you think about it. Now, these assessments can be configured completely to each council's needs, each contract type. Again, however diverse or specific you want to be, completely optional. What we recommend is the more consistent you can be with these assessments, the more value it has across the organization. If you know you're even asking just 5 standard questions to every single contract and every single supplier, no matter who else looks at that supplier and goes to engage them, they're going to know what those answers mean. They're going to be able to resonate with them, go, yes, I know that that supplier is always able to deliver on time. I'm going to know that there were no payment milestones missed. Those sorts of core details you can capture. Alternatively, you can pull through one of our templated assessments and just select the questions you'd like to have. So right here, you'll see we've got quite a large list of questions. And what you could do is you could configure to have just the top 5 of these and turn the rest off. And then you can also additionally add them as you go. So it is about deciding what is the right step now and considering what is the right step in 6 months, 12 months, a year's time. That assessment would be performed. And then again, once this assessment is completed, you can actually look at it at the supplier level. So you could see this assessment, how that supplier has performed across all their contracts, and it'll probably show you 2, 3, 4, 5 assessments. And you can look at that value. Because those assessments, if you choose, are the same, you can have aggregated results and see that a supplier is on average performing quite well. And then you'll know that they're relatively safe to engage further. Now, what you do with that information, you can pull it into your tendering process, use it for renewals, or simply just hold on to it for future reference. It's all there to be used as you decide. Now, other key areas of the contract record. Now, these ones speak a little bit more to what you'd be doing once the contract is at least later in the planning stage. So a lot of the activities we've talked about right now are about planning what you're going to be doing. And one of the last things you'll do towards that planning stage is a risk and issue review. So what we've done for the pilot councils, if we've gone right now, risk assessments are at best inconsistent. So what we recommended, and Port Macquarie, for example, has actually gone well above this because they've got quite an established risk framework and set of questions that they ask people. Whereas Queanbeyan, for example, has decided to just stick with these 3. So what we're asking is three questions just at high level categories. And all we're doing here is the instructions in the compliance activity in those steps of what you're going to do and when you're going to do it are telling you to perform a risk assessment just at these high level categories. Just consider what the risks might be. And from there, you can go in and you'll see this is a very detailed, or as you'd expect, pretty detailed risk assessment framework where you can have a type of risk, the status, increasing, decreasing, the likelihood, consequence, and grade, all configurable to your risk framework or modules, and then mitigation strategies. So how can we mitigate this? What is the likelihood post-mitigation? And importantly, when did you review this, and when are you going to review it next? So what you'll notice in Port is there are a lot of sections and areas where you can either assign tasks or give date to tasks as part of that planning activity. So if part of the planning activity is I am going to say that I'm going to perform a risk review mid-August, that means I, as the contract officer, am going to get a reminder on this record. It's going to be like, hey, Oliver, there's a risk review you plan to perform in 2 weeks. Are you ready to perform that? Here's a link to where you can go and perform that risk review. So it is all about doing an investment up front in order to make that actual management process, once the contract's in, really easy and intuitive because you've already invested that time. Similarly, if whoever was first planning that moves on, You can bulk update all those tasks, bulk change the contract, assign a new officer in 1 or 2 clicks. And then that new officer is going to have all that information. They're going to know how the supplier was doing. They're going to know when the risk reviews are due. They're going to have calendar meetings set up. They're going to be completely across everything that needs to happen and how it's going to happen. So that's the risk framework. So again, like we said, you could have this every single risk. You could have users custom adding risks, or you can leave it at a high level. And it's just about considering those groups of risks. Is the reputational damage of this contract low, medium, or high? And what is the likelihood of that? So you don't need to go down to what is every single individual reputational risk. It can be at a category level. When it comes to the unfortunate situation of an issue ever occurring, there's a section here for tracking all those issues. And again, like I said, that's super useful when you want to look at the supplier level or all your contracts and go, all right, what are the sort of issues we've had? What is the category of issues most likely to occur? Or what supplier has the most issues? And essentially, were they ever resolved? Do we have open issues sitting with 3 or 4 contracts that we are yet to get a resolution date on? Do they have an external owner, for example? Have we assigned that to someone at the supplier going, you must ensure that that issue has been resolved? And again, reminders, you can be triggered to be informed of that, or you can just have it there as a record detail. Now, a few of the other ones I'll just quickly jump through. Now, documents. So documents is a way of storing documents against the contract. What you'll actually find here too, and this is something that's been chosen to be undergone by all of the pilot councils, is that more commonly you'll be using fields called record management directory reference. Now these show up in every single record and sub-record of the system, and essentially it's a way of putting that link to whether it's your trim link or any of the other record management tools. And that can just be hyperlink clicked. And that means you stick to all your council requirements for record management. However, you still keep all the clarity at the contract level. So you don't have to upload contracts here for them to have value in the record. You can just reference them. Now, variations. Variations, again, you would never do this on a contract that isn't executed yet, like this example, but you can vary a contract. So you can do whether it's executing one of those options, so the renewals and extensions, or whether it was contingency value that you had in the contract already, or maybe it's a completely new variation for whatever unexpected reason the contract needs to be varied for whatever time. Now these variations can be dates, values, scope, any of your typical variations, and then they can also go through an approval process. Now, they don't have to go through an approval process. Again, our pilot councils, all but Port Macquarie, have selected to not put them through the approval process because they're already having that approval occur in a different system. And they already have those systems in place to ensure that it goes up as high as it needs to in the delegate authority. So it's not quite yet, the system isn't established enough to decide that they want to bring in the executives into the system. They do it for reporting mechanisms, but maybe approvals can happen as we go further on. It's one of those things where it's the horse and the cart. You want to make sure you've got all your records in place and are being actively used and understood before you try and bring in all of approvals. You don't want to have a really messy transition. And again, the way ArcBlue handles this whole implementation is all about that. It's about a journey. It's not day one, let's get everything going. It's about how do we get you there in day 365 or day whatever 2 times 365 is. All right, next we have triggers. Now, triggers is a really simple one to understand and really simple to configure, but super powerful from pretty much an automation and removing manual effort. So one thing we've realized is every single council we've talked to so far has had someone that on a weekly or monthly basis is printing out a list of contracts at their expiry date and emailing them out to people and going, hey, these are the contracts that are going to expire. So there is someone that has to do that task. What the system allows is for those reminders to be configured in the system. So what you'll see here is we've created a contract expiry warning, and at a simple level, it's going to create a task 3 months before contract expiry. So before the contract end date, it's going to remind you. Now, again, you could configure these to be 2 weeks, 6 months. You can have them trigger regularly. So it can be 1 month before expiry, and then again 2 months, and then again 3 months away. So it can remind you regularly. Or you could have triggers relating to anything else. So you could have a trigger that what it does is it actually emails the supplier and goes, hey, supplier, it's been 6 months. You're required to perform X task. So it can be configured to send emails, not just create things with import, but you could use it for very light touch supplier management. There is a module that, again, I can talk to another time that can go into really detailed supplier management and assessments, but light touch stuff where you'd normally start, you can do that all through the contract record. History and feedback. Now that's just an auditing useful tool where it will tell you who approved things, when was it done, who was it assigned to, how the contract has moved through its stages. And then notes. Notes is what you'd expect. You type in notes to essentially communicate with each other on the record if you choose, or you're likely going to have a function for that already. So that is almost all there is to it. Now, one interesting thing to know, which is especially interesting because Luke spoke to the distinct lack of these contract management plans. What we can actually do once you've populated all these records, so for example, I've gone through the contract management planning stage, I'm right at the end of it, you can actually generate a document that will be your contract management plan. Now it's just going to open up on another screen, so I'll have to drag it in for you. Give me 1 minute. Now, essentially what this is this is using document generation to pull through all of the details from that record you've created and putting it into a Word format. So if the auditors ever come across, or even just in your own internal process, you go, okay, what is our contract management plan? You can print it off or regularly update the record and then always have this to fall back on. So it's going to populate stuff like what is the contract number, what is the title, values, dates, all those sorts of stuff. But as well, it's going to go into evidence of insurance. So one of the tasks said you have to go and check your insurance details, and that's going to all be populated into here. It's going to say how you're doing your performance against contractors. What dates are you doing those performance assessments regularly? Is it going to be monthly, yearly? And who is responsible for those? And then, well, it goes through all of those sorts of details. So any details you capture on the record can be pulled out and captured in this plan. Now, it might not be necessary. You might totally see the record as a contract management plan and be totally okay with it, or it might just be for your own record keeping purposes when you want to look at it in a different structured way. Now, that is pretty much all there is to show against the records. Now, I will just very quickly show you that there is the organization module, and that's just where you track all those organizations. So as I showed you before, organizations can have almost all of those fields that we talked to. So you can not just see the contracts that are against them, but you can see who their contacts are, their certifications, their insurances, risks and issues at the supplier level, not at the contract level. Maybe they've got a risk as a supplier, even though it's not applicable to any of the contracts you have. You can do assessments against them, documents and related organizations. So you can have parent, child, subsidiaries of, you can go through all of those sorts of tree relationships within organizations. Now that's pretty much all I have to show in the quick demo. So I might throw it back to you, Mark. Thanks for the time, everyone. I hope that was relatively clear for you all.
Thanks, Holly. That was great. And a lot to show in a very short space of time. So I think there's more to certainly go through, but it is what it is. So I'm just going to go through our pilot councils, and I'm just going to share our screen. So just bear with me one sec. Okay. So when we started this pilot program off, which was Port, Arc Blue and LGP, we looked for 4 councils to, and a total of 5 councils to be involved, and LGP being the 5th group. And the councils which came on board are Northern Beaches, Central Coast Council, Queanbeyan and Palorang, and Port Macquarie Hastings. And I think there's a couple of things to note about it. Firstly is that the councils are all amalgamated councils. And secondly, all of them had quite an interesting desire to try the contract management solution because they all believed that they had a genuine need to try and get better. The other thing to note about these councils is that they're quite a mixed bag. So some of them, like Queanbeyan and Palorang, are a team of 1 through to something like Northern Beaches, where they're a reasonably large team. So there's a mixture of challenges within the pilot councils. There's a mixture of maturities within the councils. Some of the procurement people who are supporting the program are relatively new into the sector. Others have been here for quite a while. So when we started the pilot off, it was certainly an interesting mix for us to work through. We went through it. I've just summarised some of the project learns that we've got from the pilot program. The first thing to note, we started this in November, December last year, and we're still going. And it's taken a lot longer than what we originally planned. We originally thought it was going to be around a 3-month implementation, but we've been dealing with fires, we've been dealing with flood, we've been dealing with COVID-19, and we've been dealing with a whole bunch of other things that councils have been challenged with to just keep the projects moving along. And so that's the first absolute observation that we've got out of that. The second thing that we've got is that from the project's perspective, it's a program of works which is supported by this team, by the LGP, ArcBlue and Port team. So it's a change management program, which you heard Luke mention earlier, where we just continue to deliver, and we deliver within the context of developing and delivering a solution in a change management boundary. And the councils have found that quite useful because it means that they can work their way through how do they engage internally, how do they deliver, how do they start to get internal engagements. Some of the obvious things that the guys have found is that, firstly, all council contracts can now be put in one central location. And that's part of the mapping of the current processes which the councils have got, putting all the councils' solutions into one location. They've also found that they can structure the type of contracts in the system. So, for example, QPRC have had some quite significant gains in how do they structure their works, their consumables, their some of their other styles of contracts, so that it makes sense for them. Whereas previously it was paper-based, and previously it was in a whole bunch of other different departments. The other thing that councils have found as an obvious benefit is they're able to start to visualise the contracts. So things like Ollie, which is just pointed out, start dates, end dates, spends, basic contract performance, basic information about how the contract is performing. The council has now found, because it's in one location, because it's there, and because it's being mapped against the current processes, people are actually being able to find the information so much more easily and understand where their contracts are. Luke made the comment very early on about councils trying to find the contracts that they currently have and put them into one location. And that's certainly an observation that we had very early on in the project, that these 4 councils, which are relatively organised and quite sophisticated, at some points were still struggling to find some of the contracts that they needed to run with. There are some unexpected benefits that have come out of the pilot program so far. The first unexpected benefit that we've come across is that the CLMS system presents well, and they've found that the procurement people have found that when they take this solution to other stakeholders in council, they're finding that the stakeholders are finding that the system is well laid out and it's relatively intuitive how to use. So comments that we're getting back are saying that, we take it to other areas. They're saying, yes, we understand it. It adds a little, it's better than what we've currently got. It's certainly better than what some of the other opposition, other things that they've seen. But they're finding that the ability to roll out this solution across council is quite intuitive because of the system design. And probably the last thing I'll just put as an unexpected benefit from the councils is that there's an openness of information. We're finding that because the information's been put in one location, because we're finding that it's being structured against what the councils are requiring in the pilot program, we're finding that the information which is needed is open and available to all those that are wanting to use it. So to date, the pilot programs have still got a ways to go. We're getting towards the back end of the implementation program, and we're not exactly certain when those dates will conclude because of COVID being a little bit difficult at the councils. But I think to date, that's what we're seeing in the pilot councils in some of the feedback that we're gaining. So the overall comment I'd make is that councils have found that the change management and support which has been given to the program has been quite useful. They've found that the system itself has been good because all the information has been placed into one location, and they've found that the system is intuitive enough and designed well enough so that when they're talking to their internal stakeholders, it's relatively easy to talk through and for the stakeholders to understand what their needs and requirements are. I think that's the key points that we've got so far. So I might move on from that, from how the pilot programs are going, and I just might step into the Q&A element. So with the Q&A, I'm just going to stop sharing and just reflect on some of the questions that have come through. So the first question we've got is around Tech One and around Civica. So the questions is, some councils will want to go with Tech One so they have everything in one system. However, Tech One doesn't match needs. How do we educate council to acknowledge this shortfall? And then from Isabel, same with the Civica team. For that, what we find is that part of this process of helping council educate is part of the demonstrations that we're going through. We also, part of the conversations that we have with council is to take the stakeholders through what Tech One does, doesn't do, what the solution that we're going through does, doesn't do. And we can help with what part of the question we can also help with is what's the council actually requiring? So if you think of it and you think of a contract management solution, don't think of Tech One, don't think of Civica, think of what are your requirements. And it can help, we can help map that back as to what this solution will do, as to what council's requirements are. If that answers the question. The next question from Stuart, the financial spend against a contract, especially goods and services, is this via a link to the financial package like Tech One? Ollie, I might throw that one to you to have a thought on.
So yes, it can be via an integration. Now what that integration looks like, I guess, depends on what are your requirements. So we're already working with Tech One to establish a relatively standard and universal integration. So just basic expenditure, just enough that you can see it in a different way. So see it against all your contract details. When it comes to other systems, so Civica and any of the others, it can be built in a custom way, but we're also looking to make as many of those integrations as possible. It's sort of a philosophy we have here at Port that we're not a system by itself. We're a system that looks for all of those other systems and is only enhanced by the amount of data we can have access to. So we're all about using APIs to access all those records. If that high level explains the concept for you.
Thanks, Ollie. And the last question, I'll just conscious of time, last question. And this is probably a question which I'll direct to Kerry when I see that she's online still. Has the Child Council's project team been engaged to see if Port meets their requirements for detailed day-to-day contract management?
So sorry, has the
Trial Council project team been engaged to see if Port meets their requirements for detailed day-to-day contract management?
So we have. So we have worked closely with all of the councils that are undertaking the pilot program to make sure the solution actually meets their needs. And there is actually a high level of configuration that is available, but we've also had a group session where we brought all of the councils together that are on the pilot program and got their input into both the hub and the contract management system to make sure that it does meet overarchingly council's needs across New South Wales. So we are doing both. As with any council that takes up this solution, we do work with you very closely around ensuring that the configuration meets your unique needs. But we are obviously standardising that process where possible across all New South Wales councils. So there is a combination in the implementation process of both the standardised, which helps with pre-configuration and implementation at a much faster level, as well as making sure that every single council, the system can meet your own individual and unique needs, which each council does have slightly different needs in relation to their contract management. So,
thanks, Kerry. So guys, I'm conscious of time. We're a little bit over now. So I want to start wrapping this up. So firstly, for everyone that's been on this webinar, we'll be corresponding with you afterwards with a basic EOI, and we'll also be talking about our financial model, how this actually works. The webinar has been recorded, so we'll give us a little time to get that recording sorted out, and for those who want it, we'll give you the link and all the information. And the last thing I will share with everyone is just around some of our contact details. And our contact details are the, just bear with me a sec. So if you look there, there's some contact details, contact numbers. We'll send them out in a pack to everyone, so we can work on those. You can contact us and get information afterwards. Everybody, thank you for your time today, and thank you for your time on a day when we're all so far away from each other. So we really appreciate this, and we hope that today we've shared some information which will be useful for you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Thanks,
you. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.